October 30th, 1938, the night before Halloween in a year when headlines of economic uncertainty and approaching World War were far scarier than anything the holiday had to offer. Shortly after 8 p.m., many Americans turned their radios to CBS, where they heard authentic-sounding news bulletins describing massive explosions on the surface of the planet Mars. Soon, announcers were reporting that Martian spacecraft were landing outside major U.S. cities, releasing massive fighting machines that killed everything in their path with death rays and poison gas. Listeners heard the Martians wipe out the U.S. military, and then a voice that sounded like President Roosevelt's asking them to remain calm. But it was only after the Martians conquered New York City that listeners heard an announcement explaining that this was not in fact real news, but instead a radio dramatization by 23-year-old Orson Welles' Mercury Theater on the Air of The War of the Worlds.
The H.G. Wells classic, which is the original for many fantasies about invasions by mythical monsters from the planet Mars.
But by that point, according to popular legend, it was too late. Thousands of listeners had already taken the fake news to be true and fled their homes in terror, putting on gas masks, grabbing firearms, and clogging the streets in a mad rush to escape the imaginary invaders. Thanks largely to the sensational reporting in the next day's newspapers, stories of the War of the Worlds panic earned a permanent place in our popular culture and made the name of the young Orson Welles.
I'm extremely surprised to learn that a story which has become familiar to children through the medium of comic strips and many succeeding novels and adventure stories should have had such an immediate and profound effect upon radio listeners.
At least, that was the story I knew when I began researching the War of the Worlds broadcast, not knowing how much that narrative has been picked apart by academics and researchers in the years since, who seriously question the size and scale of the panic and the objectivity of the newspapers that reported it. But, whether these authors believed in the panic or not, I soon discovered that they generally relied on the same sources over and over again, without adding anything new. Without a new source of contemporary, unfiltered data about the audience response to the War of the Worlds broadcast, it seemed like there wasn't much more that could be said. Luckily, I knew that here at the University of Michigan, among two collections of Orson Welles' papers in the Special Collections Library, are preserved nearly 1,500 letters he and the Mercury Theater received immediately after their infamous broadcast. These letters, only recently rediscovered, had never before been used by historians, and when I combined them with hundreds of other letters preserved at the National Archives, which were written to the FCC and other federal agencies, I had nearly 2,000 pieces of correspondence in response to the broadcast, coming from a broad swath of Americans, literally from penthouses to prisons. Reading the words of these long-lost listeners brought me into their homes and automobiles as they experienced the show firsthand, with a level of intimacy and immediacy I could never have gleaned from the newspaper accounts and sociological studies other researchers had relied upon. But as I began aggregating these data on my computer, looking not just at how many letters were for and against Welles, but what topics and trends kept reappearing, I began to realize that the audience response to the War of the Worlds broadcast was more complex than I had imagined. By combining both collections of letters, I found that most were written by people frightened and angered not by the broadcast itself, but by the stories of panic they'd read in the newspapers, and what they believed that said about the state of their nation. Rather than simply being proof of the media's ability to manipulate and deceive, the War of the Worlds broadcast became an opportunity to examine the anxieties listeners had about mass media in its infancy, such as its potential ability to empower a dictator or to negatively impact the developing minds of children. In its reporting of events like the Hindenburg explosion in 1937, radio had proved that it could spread news and information with unprecedented speed and realism.
It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast of the humanity.
But, with the War of the Worlds broadcast, Orson Welles reminded Americans that realism does not necessarily equal reliability, a reminder we need perhaps more today than we did in 1938. In my thesis, I made the case that the War of the Worlds broadcast prefigured many of the challenges that mass media and the internet present us with today, and by understanding that event better, we would understand our own culture better and, perhaps, avoid some of the mistakes of our forebears. This thesis began because of the University of Michigan's Wells collections and was nurtured along by the resources provided to me by the university libraries, from every book I could possibly need to databases that put newspaper articles and radio broadcasts from the 1930s at my fingertips. And this makes it even more of an honor to be recognized by these libraries for this research. It was a privilege to make use of these resources, and as I work to publish this thesis as a book, I hope my research will continue to reflect well on the institution that made it possible.